You know, when you go to see like a massive grand theatrical production, there is this unspoken agreement between you and the actors on stage.
Right, like a suspension of disbelief.
Exactly. You sit in the dark, the lights come up, and for a couple of hours, you all just agree to believe that the painted cardboard backdrop is a towering castle. You accept the dialogue as the absolute truth of that universe. It is this shared illusion.
Yeah.
But imagine someone hands you a pair of infrared glasses, and suddenly you can see through the dark. You see the stagehands frantically rushing around, propping up the cardboard, pulling the strings, whispering cues.
Oh, wow, that would ruin the magic pretty quickly.
Completely. You realize the real story isn't the dialogue being spoken under the spotlight. It is the hidden mechanics keeping the whole illusion from collapsing.
That makes total sense.
So today, we are putting on those glasses. We're doing a deep dive into a fascinating and frankly quite intense interview with political analyst Mr. Hassan Habibi, broadcast on Radio Rava.
Yes, and this is a really compelling source to dig into.
It really is. Habibi basically argues that everything we think we know about the geopolitical chess match between the U.S., Israel, and Iran. I mean, the diplomatic treaties, the military strikes, even the opposition protests on our social media feeds. He says all of it is an engineered illusion. So today, we are going to tear down that illusion layer by layer to see what actually threatens this regime.
And, before we jump into the deep end, I think we need to set some ground rules for you, the listener.
Definitely.
Because we are dealing with intense, highly debated geopolitical analysis today from Mr. Habibi. We really need to put our objective hats on. Our job here isn't to take sides or tell you if his analysis is right or wrong.
Right. We are just the messengers.
Exactly. Our job is to map out his underlying logic so you can judge the geopolitical chessboard for yourself. We are analyzing the mechanics of his perspective, examining the why and the how behind his arguments without, endorsing or validating the specific viewpoints.
Yeah, the goal is strict comprehension. So let's get into it. Habibi starts by basically taking a sledgehammer to the very concept of modern international diplomacy regarding this conflict.
He really does not hold back.
Not at all. He argues that any recent agreements or, understandings between the United States and Iran are completely fabricated. He doesn't just doubt their long-term effectiveness. He literally calls the entire diplomatic process a ridiculous theater.
A ridiculous theater.
Yeah. In his view, the regime in Iran has zero intention of ending tensions. They are simply orchestrating a performance to buy time on the world stage.
And he points out that returning to some pre-war era of appeasement or even normal diplomatic relations is historically impossible at this stage. The fundamental power dynamic has just shifted too much.
So it is too late to put the genie back in the bottle.
Exactly. And to illustrate how hollow this theater actually is, Habibi uses a very specific high-profile example. He points to the diplomatic efforts by French President Emmanuel Macron, specifically that big meeting held at the Palace of Versailles.
Oh, Versailles. I mean, that projects ultimate historical power and grandeur. That is the place where empires draw maps.
Right, and that aesthetic choice was entirely by design. But according to Habibi, it was completely devoid of substance. His claim is that France actually holds zero real leverage in the specific localized conflict between the U.S., Israel, and Iran.
Wait, zero leverage? Really?
That is his argument. He says France had nothing of geopolitical value to offer either side to broker a real deal. I mean, if you don't have military leverage or significant economic leverage that can actually alter the Iranian regime's behavior, you are basically just hosting a very expensive dinner party.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. It sounds like Habibi is saying this diplomatic dance is like two people fiercely negotiating the lease terms for a building that is already on fire.
Or, offering to change the wallpaper in a house while completely ignoring the fact that the foundation is rigged with dynamite.
Yeah, exactly. France is offering surface-level aesthetics, but they have absolutely no control over the actual explosive.
And taking that a step further, Habibi argues the only actual chip France had to play was a domestic one.
What do you mean?
Well, he claims their only offering was an agreement to crack down on Iranian opposition groups residing within France. So they were essentially offering to police dissidents in Paris to appease the regime in Tehran.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so the Grand Summit at Versailles wasn't about solving a Middle Eastern geopolitical crisis at all. It was transactional appeasement, masquerading as peacemaking.
So if France is just offering wallpaper and all this high-level diplomacy is just a smokescreen to buy time, What is the actual dynamite in the foundation? Because, the headlines always tell us the tension is about human rights abuses or proxy wars or economic instability.
Right, but Habibi strips all of that away. He asserts that the root of the international conflict is strictly and entirely about Iran's nuclear enrichment.
Just the nuclear issue.
Yes, it is about the existential threat that a nuclear-armed regime poses to Israel, as both nations are basically locked in a zero-sum battle for regional dominance. The proxy conflicts and the human rights abuses, well, they are secondary symptoms in the eyes of the international community.
So the primary disease, the real dynamite, is the nuclear capability.
Exactly. And he specifically points to a recent 40-day conflict to prove that conventional methods of dealing with this nuclear threat have completely failed.
Okay, so why did they fail?
Well, the failure of that conflict is incredibly revealing when you look at the mechanics of the regime's defense. Habibi points out that all the conventional weapons utilized by global and regional superpowers fundamentally failed to weaken the regime.
Just because of the weapons themselves.
Actually, the reason is purely physical and geographical. The regime's true military assets, their drone manufacturing, their advanced centrifuges, their nuclear capabilities, they are deeply buried underground. They are literally carved into mountainsides.
Oh, right. Because you can control the skies, you can bomb surface infrastructure, you can wipe out runways, but bunker-busting munitions have a physical limit.
Exactly. If the asset is buried beneath hundreds of feet of solid rock, a conventional airstrike is basically just scratching the surface.
And what about economic warfare? I mean, sanctions are usually the go-to tool, right?
Habibi argues that also fails, and it fails due to the regime's internal calculus. The international community often tries to plunge the general population into economic hardship with sanctions.
Right, hoping civilian unrest will force the government to change its behavior.
Exactly. But according to Habibi, the regime genuinely does not care if the populace lacks water, electricity, or basic goods. Their only economic concern is maintaining enough capital to fund their internal security forces, the apparatus that suppresses the population.
Wow. So as long as the security forces get paid, the civilian economic suffering is just totally irrelevant to the regime's survival.
That is his point, yeah. And on top of being physically dug into the mountains and insulated from domestic economic suffering, Habibi points out they hold a massive global economic trump card.
Let me guess. The Strait of Hormuz.
You got it. The mechanics of the Strait of Hormuz are terrifying from a global economic perspective. A massive percentage of the world's oil consumption flows through that narrow maritime choke point.
And the regime has the ability to effectively close it.
Right. They can threaten Saudi oil fields, they can target international shipping lanes, they can lay mines. By merely threatening to choke off global energy supplies, they have forced neighboring Arab states into a very tense silence.
So the world has essentially been pulled back from fully backing military action against Iran because the resulting global energy crisis would just trigger a catastrophic worldwide recession.
Exactly. It is a massive deterrent.
Okay, so let me get this straight. Since military strikes can't reach the underground facilities and sanctions don't break the regime's security apparatus, and a full-scale military occupation of a massive, complex geography like Iran is impossible without catastrophic loss of life. Doesn't that mean the global community is essentially out of traditional options?
It really does seem that way.
I mean, if we are out of bullets and we are out of treaties, how does anyone approach this?
Well, Habibi's analysis suggests that traditional options are indeed exhausted because the West is fundamentally misunderstanding the nature of the target.
Misunderstanding how?
To understand why this regime is so indestructible from the outside, he says we have to stop looking at their weapons and start looking at their ideological DNA.
Okay. So it is a shift from attacking the physical to attacking the conceptual.
Exactly. Habibi argues a crucial point regarding this conceptual structure. He says the regime is not reliant on a single individual.
But wait, in Western geopolitical thinking, there is often a reliance on the decapitation strike theory, right?
Right, the idea that if the supreme leader, Khamenei, dies, the whole system will inherently collapse into a power vacuum.
But Habibi doesn't buy that.
He completely rejects it. He says Khamenei is not the linchpin.
Yeah.
The regime is a deeply entrenched ideological structure that systematically misuses religion to maintain a brutal machine of suppression.
So it's much bigger than one guy.
Exactly. He makes a massive historical comparison here to drive that point home. He likens the ideological dominance of the regime to the absolute power of the pre-Renaissance church in Europe, which held sway for roughly 1,400 years.
Wow, 1,400 years. That is intense.
Yeah, and ideological systems of that magnitude, systems that claim divine legitimacy to justify absolute earthly power, they do not fall overnight just because a single leader dies. A pope dying didn't end the dominance of the church.
Right.
These systems require a fundamental structural shock. They require a Martin Luther type of ideological reckoning to break the spell. The architecture of the regime is literally built to survive the loss of its operators.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting to me. It makes me think of this not as a single computer that you can just unplug from the wall, but more like a highly decentralized blockchain network.
Oh, that is a really good way to put it.
Right. In a blockchain, the data isn't stored in one central server. It is distributed across thousands of independent nodes. If you take out one node, even a very important one, like a supreme leader, the network doesn't die.
It just routes around it.
Exactly. The underlying code, which in this case is the ideology of absolute suppression and forced compliance, just keeps running perfectly on all the other nodes. The system is explicitly designed to be leaderless in its survival.
And that ideological code of the regime dictates its survival mechanisms. Executions, kidnappings, crushing dissent, suppressing women. That machine keeps churning regardless of who's technically sitting in the top chair because the system itself demands those actions to sustain its power.
So if a bunker buster bomb can't kill a decentralized ideology and a diplomatic treaty can't negotiate with it, logically, an ideology can only be defeated by a counter-ideology. You have to introduce a conflicting code into the network, which leads us straight into what Habibi proposes as the actual antidote.
Right. Habibi argues that the true existential threat to the regime, the only thing that actually terrifies them, is an organized, ideologically opposed resistance.
And who is that specifically?
He points to the People's Mojahedin Organization of Iran, known as the PMOI, and the broader coalition, the National Council of Resistance of Iran, the NCRI, alongside armed Kurdish groups.
And the reason he calls them the antidote isn't just because they are opposed to the regime politically, right?
No, it is much deeper than that. It is because they are the exact ideological mirror opposite of the regime's DNA in every measurable category. Habibi breaks down this ideological clash by tracing it back decades, noting that these forces have been ideologically opposed from the very beginning.
Let's look at the mechanics of this opposition.
Okay, so where the regime's ideology is fundamentally and structurally anti-women, dictating how they dress, barring them from certain professions, legally treating them as second-class citizens to maintain control, the resistance deliberately demands and elevates female leadership.
So it is a direct contradiction to the regime's foundational premise.
Exactly. Furthermore, where the regime relies heavily on public executions and the death penalty as a primary tool to maintain fear and compliance, the resistance explicitly campaigns to abolish the death penalty entirely.
Wow, entirely.
Yes, Habibi notes they even advocate abolishing it for the current supreme leader himself, should he be overthrown.
That is a massive shift.
It is. And crucially, where the regime forces its specific, hardline interpretation of religion into every facet of state law, the resistance demands the absolute separation of church and state.
Okay, I have to pause here because this presents a massive logical contradiction on the world stage.
What do you mean?
Well, if this resistance is the perfect ready-made antidote, I mean, if they represent female leadership, secularism, and human rights, and if, as Habibi points out, they aren't asking for foreign troops or foreign money, just global recognition.
Yeah.
Why on earth do Western governments restrict them? The source material mentions these groups are often censored, their rallies in places like France are restricted, and they are kept on the margins. Why silence the cure?
It is a great question, and this brings us back to the diplomatic theater we discussed at the beginning.
Right.
International politics is incredibly muddy, and it is often driven by short-term transactional gains rather than long-term ideological solutions. Habibi argues that foreign governments intentionally sideline this real resistance because of competing interests and the lingering desperate hope for appeasement.
So they don't want to rock the boat.
Exactly. Western powers don't want to anger the regime by officially recognizing the one group the regime fears most. They are still hoping for that impossible diplomatic deal regarding the nuclear program.
So they are intentionally neutralizing the antidote to avoid upsetting the disease, hoping the disease will willingly negotiate its own containment.
That is the tragic irony Habibi points out. And this intentional marginalization of the organized resistance creates a massive political vacuum in the international narrative.
Because nature abhors a vacuum.
Absolutely. When Western governments refuse to engage with the actual resistance, there is an empty space where an opposition should be. And the regime's intelligence apparatus is brilliant at filling vacuums with their own carefully curated decoys.
Oh, this is where Habibi's analysis gets wild, because he is essentially telling us to question the authenticity of everything we see scrolling through our news feeds.
He goes completely on the offensive against other prominent opposition figures, most notably Reza Pahlavi, the son of the ousted Shah.
Yeah, Habibi's critique here is scathing.
It really is. He dismisses Pahlavi as someone who has historically been irrelevant, but is now merely riding a wave of recent protests. Crucially, Habibi alleges that Pahlavi is heavily propped up and funded by foreign interests and very specific media networks.
Like Iran International and Monoto, right?
Yes. He argues these networks artificially inflate Pahlavi's importance to serve an external agenda, painting him as a leader when he has no actual organizational infrastructure on the ground inside Iran.
But wait, we have all seen the footage. I mean, there are videos of protests inside Iran where people are actively chanting in favor of the Shah or his family. If Pahlavi is an irrelevant, artificially inflated figurehead with no ground game, how does Habibi explain crowds of ordinary Iranians risking their lives to chant his name?
Habibi explains this tactic as one of the most insidious forms of state survival. He argues that many of those pro-Shah chants at grassroots protests are actually orchestrated by the regime itself.
Wait, that sounds incredibly risky. If you are a fragile, highly paranoid, authoritarian regime, the absolute last thing you want is a massive crowd getting comfortable chanting against you. Even if your own intelligence officers started the chant, how does Habibi justify a regime taking that massive risk?
You have to look at the psychology of the tactic. The intelligence apparatus uses embedded provocateurs. They wait for legitimate, organic protests to start, usually over economic issues like the price of bread or unpaid wages.
Okay.
Once the crowd is gathered, these provocateurs inject pro-Shah chants into the mix. Why take the risk? Because it immediately taints the protest in the eyes of the international community.
Oh, I see. It changes the narrative from citizens demanding fundamental democratic change to citizens demanding a return to the previous dictatorship.
Exactly. It frames the protest as backward-looking rather than forward-looking.
That is incredibly manipulative.
It is a masterful diversion tactic. By artificially inflating a rival who has no organized structure, no real power base to threaten the state, and who represents a return to a past dictatorship, the regime successfully distracts the world.
They provide the West with a harmless, burnt-out figure to look at.
Yes, which diverts attention away from the real, highly organized resistance that actually possesses the ideological tools to dismantle the regime.
So the narrative of a fragmented Iranian opposition that we constantly hear about, the idea that the opposition is hopelessly divided and fighting itself, that might be entirely manufactured.
Habibi claims the idea that the opposition is a chaotic mess is pure propaganda, actively manufactured and spread by the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and their massive overseas intelligence network.
Wait, we know the Quds Force, the external arm of the IRGC, operates militarily across the Middle East, funding proxy militias in Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen. But Habibi is saying they've essentially built an equivalent overseas operation purely from media manipulation and Western political lobbying.
According to this analysis, yes. Habibi notes they have thousands of operatives and influencers embedded outside of Iran, specifically working in Western media, academia, and political circles.
Thousands, wow.
Yeah, and their goal isn't military. It is informational. They push this narrative that the enemies of the regime are just endlessly bickering with each other over who gets to hold power after the regime falls, rather than actively fighting to topple it right now.
So it paints the opposition as petty, disorganized, and untrustworthy.
Exactly. And if the world believes the opposition is a chaotic mess that would just plunge the country into civil war, Western powers will default to trying to negotiate with the devil they know, the regime itself.
Which brings us right back to the grand theater of diplomacy we started with. It is a perfectly closed loop.
It really is. The regime creates the illusion of a fragmented opposition. The West uses that illusion as a convenient excuse to ignore the organized resistance.
And instead, the West engages in pointless diplomatic theater that only serves to buy the regime more time to bury its nuclear capabilities deeper into the mountains.
It is incredibly layered. When we step back and synthesize everything Mr. Habibi has laid out, he is painting a picture of an absolute ideological deadlock.
Yeah, traditional diplomacy has been exposed as a hollow theater of transactional appeasement.
And conventional warfare has hit a literal geographic wall because the regime's assets are untouchable and they hold the global economy hostage via the Strait of Hormuz.
Therefore, his conclusion is that the only viable existential threat to the regime is an organized, ideologically opposed resistance, a counter-ideology that dismantles the regime's theological justifications for absolute power.
Yet this true antidote is being actively obscured by a combination of international appeasement and highly sophisticated state-sponsored media manipulation that props up fake alternatives.
It really forces you to reevaluate the lens through which you view geopolitical news. When you see a summit at Versailles or a protest video on social media, you have to ask yourself, who actually benefits from the story I am being told right now? Am I watching the play or am I looking at the stagehands?
That is the million-dollar question.
Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with. Something for you to mull over that builds on the mechanics we've unpacked today.
Let's hear it.
If Habibi's analysis holds true, and the ultimate fatal vulnerability of a deeply entrenched authoritarian regime is not its military hardware, but an opposing idea.
Right.
I mean, if the regime is more terrified of a secular counter-ideology than they are of a bunker-busting airstrike, then how much time, energy, and billions of dollars is the global community wasting on building better bombs and negotiating empty treaties when they really should be focusing all that effort on protecting, amplifying, and recognizing better ideas?
It is a powerful perspective.
You can try to negotiate the least terms or change the wallpaper all you want, but eventually you have to admit the foundation is rigged. And the only way out is to stop talking to the arsonist and start supporting the people holding the water. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives, keep looking behind the curtain, and we will catch you next time.